This is our rafter square. It can be used for a bunch of different things, but two other features are a little less intuitive, so I thought we would take a closer look at them today. It's these two scales going from 1 to 30. But before we look at them, let's start with the scale at the bottom, which is used for drawing angles. You rotate the square around the pivot, you use the scale to see what angle you have, and you draw along the opposing edge. The scale above works in exactly the same way, except it doesn't measure the angle in degrees, but in decimeter per meter rise. So what does that mean? Well, let's say you're working on a roof and you don't know the angle. Then you start with measuring 1 meter horizontally, and then you measure the change in elevation vertically. If the vertical distance is, for example, 6 decimeters, then you would have a rise of 6 decimeter per meter, and you could draw that angle by rotating the square and aligning the 6 on the scale with the edge of your workpiece. And up here, you now have the angle that corresponds to a 6 decimeter per meter rise. This scale is often used when you're building houses and making rafters, and is used for making common rafters or normal rafters, while the scale at the top is used for making more specific types of rafters, called hip rafters and valley rafters. Let's take a look at a hip rafter. If you have two roof sides that meet, you will have to build a diagonal rafter to support them at the intersection. This is called a hip rafter. Since the hip rafter goes diagonally, it has a longer span, and therefore the angle at the top is different from the angle of a common rafter. You could try to measure or calculate it, but if the roofs have the same inclination and meet at a 90-degree angle, we could get the angle by just using the scale on the rafter square instead. It's quite simple. If you cut your common rafters with, say, a 6 on this scale, then you cut the hip rafters with the 6 on this scale. And if you cut your common rafters with the 8 on this scale, you cut the hip rafters with the 8 on this scale, and so on. So, to summarize, this scale is for drawing angles, but they are measured in decimeter per meter instead of degrees. And the top scale is used for translating the angle of a common rafter into the correct angle for a hip or a valley rafter.